Good evening. My name is Bill Martin, and I'm associated with the Baker Institute. Welcome you to this program. I think you're going to find it to be quite stimulating. In the early days of the Baker Institute, when it existed in a row of offices at the front of Fondren Library, and the principles and interests that would guide its work were still in being formulated, Mr. Harry Siobhan met with Ambassador Jerigian and to express his strong hope that religion not be neglected among those forces that would receive substantial attention in this new institution. Having just returned from his post as the United States ambassador to Israel, and having formerly served as ambassador to Syria, Ed Jerigian was well prepared to assure Mr. Siobhan with all sincerity that he understood the importance of religion in contemporary world affairs. And he has repeatedly demonstrated that conviction, and as most of you know, Harry Siobhan has continued to play a significant role in supporting the Institute's efforts to give attention to the role of religious factors on the national and international scene. Through Harry Siobhan's generosity, we're able to present 3 stimulating programs during the spring of the year dealing with the impact of religion on the 2000 elections, the appropriate relationship between religion and government, and the strengths and weaknesses of President Bush's faith-based initiative. A program on the impact of religion on public and private education, which was scheduled for the week after the September 11 attacks, had to be postponed, but we will be presenting that sometime probably after the first of the year. We're still working on a program dealing with the issues of evolution and the intelligent design movement. But no program in this series is likely to be of greater import than the one tonight. Since September 11, we've seen a number of competing explanations for what happened and various reactions to it. We've been told that it is a religious war and that it is not, that appeals to religion are simply a cover for other grievances, that they hate us because we are successful and they have failed, because our culture is an offense to their religious principles, and because of our support of Israel, our treatment of Iraq, and our basing troops in Arabia, the home of the 2 holy sites of Mecca and Medina. Because religion is often interwoven tightly with particular cultures and ethnic groups, it can be impossible to disentangle discrete components and label them correctly as secular or religious, sincere or manipulative, beneficial or dangerous. It's also true, however, that religion can be a powerful force in its own right, since in much of the world, including the United States, religious structures often exhibit enormous strength and resilience. In some areas, they are stronger than existing governments and may represent the true effective power, capable either of shoring up or bringing down a secular government. This important fact may be overlooked by political scientists, economists, sociologists, mainstream media, policymakers, and diplomats whose milieu is likely to be in an advanced stage of secularization. Within these circles, the spiritual, the supernatural, or more precisely the non-empirical, these dimensions of life are shouldered out of the arena, both during professional preparation and on the job. If religion is not taken seriously in one's own circles, it's easy to conclude that it need not be taken seriously at all. When people profess or appear to be acting from religious motives, there's a temptation to ignore them as ignorant or insubstantial people, or to look for their real motive, which will surely involve money or power. When religious leaders and positions with which one is unfamiliar seem to have wide popular support, it may be easier to seek out and try to deal with secular politicians or military leaders who hold offices and ranks, since one has talked to their kind before. Without proper glasses, it is sometimes difficult to see certain things. Surely the best example of that in recent years has been Iran. It's now widely accepted that the 1979 revolution was in large measure what it declared itself to be, a powerful reaction to Western modernization, are orchestrated and led by clerics representing an extremist form of the Shiite sect, itself a minority within Islam. Extreme as it was, however, it bore a kinship to a much broader Islamic reaction to modernization in general and to its Western form in particular. For different reasons, not least of which was its atheism, communism didn't offer a viable alternative to Western modernization and the threat that it was deemed to pose to piety and morality. The only well-developed and plausible alternative was to be found in Islam. Now, it may well be that a full and nuanced understanding of the situation on the part of the United States would have changed little, but it's also widely accepted that we were almost completely blindsided by events in Iran. In his 1988 book, The Eagle and the Lion, The Tragedy of American-Iranian Relations, James Bill reported that the lone proposal by the CIA to pay close attention to the religious dimension of Iranian politics and to monitor the activities and attitudes of the more prominent religious leaders before the revolution was, quote, vetoed on the grounds that it would amount to mere sociology, a term used in intelligence circles to mean the time-wasting study of factors deemed politically irrelevant. The strategic, economic, and political factors typically considered when nations, particularly Western nations, face diplomatic challenges throughout the world seem to rule out what happened in Iran. But it happened, and America wasn't prepared for it. And no one expects a simple, one-size-fits-all explanation to suffice, and we likely won't arrive at full consensus this evening. But it's clear that religion is a player of considerable magnitude in the turmoil that roils the world these days. And we're extremely fortunate to have in our company this evening 4 men who can help us sort out some of the complexities of the contemporary situation in the Middle East, examining in turn aspects of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity with additional observations from Ambassador Edward Jerigian, based on his long experience in and deep knowledge of that troubled region. Our first speaker is John Esposito. Professor Esposito is a university professor at Georgetown, where he has been professor of religion and international affairs and professor of Islamic studies for some time. He's also the founding director of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, with which the Baker Institute has a growing and mutually advantageous relationship. Professor Esposito is perhaps the premier academic interpreter of modern Islam. He has conducted research and lectured throughout the Muslim world. He is the author, co-author, or editor of more than 30 books, including such titles as Political Islam, The Challenge of Change, Muslims on the Americanization Path, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, and several volumes about women in Islam. He's also the editor of the Oxford History of Islam. He's published many articles in professional journals, countless newspaper articles based on his research. Most recently, perhaps you have seen him featured prominently in the CNN special feature moderated by Christiane Amanpour. I first met Professor Esposito 15 years ago when Professor Fred Vondermaiden and I organized a summer program on fundamentalism for visiting scholars and invited him to speak. I was immediately struck by his being what our family refers to as a splendid splainer. That term derives from a book some of us had read as children and referred originally to a teacher who was much admired by the child characters in that book. But we use it to designate someone with a gift for taking extensive and complicated materials and talking about them in ways that are clear to intelligent lay people without sacrificing the complexity and nuances of those materials. John Esposito clearly has that gift, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the Baker Institute.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and I'm delighted to be back here. The only problem is that one of your comments depresses me. When you get get to the point where somebody says, I remember we did something 15 years ago. It's, other than my marriage of 36 years, I try to block out these sort of references. I don't say things like an old friend anymore because it has a more literal meaning. In any case, tonight I'll be talking about, in some ways, what I like to call the army of God or the soldiers of God. Let me be clear ahead of time that the topic that I deal with is controversial to begin with. There are many takes on it. And the topic is even more sensitive in light of September 11. But it seems to me that unless we try to get a handle on what we're dealing with, the risk is that we will wind up backing into situations that can be avoided. To try to put this in some kind of perspective, if we want to understand Mr. bin Laden and al-Qaeda, we have to understand what Islamic fundamentalism is. What do we mean when we talk about Islamic fundamentalism or political Islam, which is, from my point of view, a more preferable term. And we have to realize that the 20th century, particularly the last half of the 20th century, has in fact been marked by the rise of political Islam, and with that, the emergence of a culture of militant jihad. Now, it's interesting that from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, if one were looking at the development of the Middle East and the broader Muslim world, one would have said that there was a trend towards modernization. There was a trend towards a more secular path of development. Certainly when modern Muslim states and modern Middle Eastern states emerged as independent nation states after a long period of European colonialism, this would be roughly post-World War II, there was the sense and indeed the paradigm that said to be modern was to be Western and to be more secular. And so we saw countries like Lebanon and Egypt and Iran and Turkey as kind of leading that wave along with some of the North African countries. However, in the late 1960s and early 70s, a series of crises across the region set into motion a sense of failure and a quest for identity. What am I referring to? The 1967 Arab-Israeli War, what is called the Six-Day War. I would say it was about a 6-hour war. The combined forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, seen as the strongest of the Arab militaries, barely got off the ground. Totally defeated, massive loss of territory, and particularly the loss of Jerusalem from a Muslim point of view. It's interesting to see how those territories are still being contested. The loss of Jerusalem made the Palestinian crisis an Islamic issue. Let me say that again. The loss of Jerusalem makes the Arab-Israeli conflict a worldwide Islamic issue for 1.2 billion Muslims and for the 56 Muslim countries in the world. And that becomes very important in terms of understanding what is going on today in the Muslim world and also understanding part of the motivation and the worldview of somebody like bin Laden. But there were other crises. The Pakistan-Bangladesh civil war in 1971. Pakistan was founded as a united nation, West Pakistan, East Pakistan, and it basically split apart, and Muslim nationalism seemed to have failed. The Lebanese civil war, a mosaic of Christians, of Sunni Muslims, of Shiite Muslims and Druze, sometimes celebrated as this pluralistic mosaic, was simply shattered. What came out of that period was a resurgence of religion. Now remember, this was happening before the global resurgence of religion that we now all acknowledge, that we see in Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. And so in many ways, running against a modernization theory that thought that every day and every way to be modern was to become more Western and secular, the idea that you would see an Islamic resurgence, a resurgence of religion, throughout the Muslim world, not just in the more traditional countries, but in fact, in its strongest form, in the most modernizing of countries, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Iran, in Turkey, blew everybody's mind. It went against all of the expectations. Now, that resurgence takes place on two planes, as indeed I would say the global religious resurgence does. For many, it stays at the personal level. People become more religiously observant. Prayer, fasting, family values, dress. For others, there is the sense that religion is not only about private life, but about public life. And therefore, in Islam, that means the impact of Islam on politics and society. It is that form that we're dealing with tonight, what some call political Islam or brand as Islamic fundamentalism. In that form, there are two aspects. On the one hand, governments increasingly appealing to religion to legitimate their rule, to mobilize popular support. And on the other hand, reform and opposition movements also appealing to religion. So gone from the late 1960s is liberal nationalism. Gone from the late 1960s is any appeal to Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. The simple fact is that for the last few decades and for the foreseeable future, if you're talking about political symbols and rhetoric, that which can organize and mobilize the largest number of people, it is more often than not religion. It's come to be what governments appeal to, but also what some governments fear in terms of an opposition. Because they're not just dealing with an opposition that is human. It is an opposition that refers to God as the basis for its legitimacy. Now, how did we experience it? We experienced it through revolutionary Iran. And so for many Americans that knew nothing about the second largest of the world's religions, that had no sense of what was going on in the Muslim world, for many in America and Europe who 20 or 30 years ago felt or experienced Islam as invisible in their own settings, unlike today when Islam is the second or third largest religion in Europe and America, this was an absolute stunner. In addition to that, we Americans who see ourselves as a wonderful people, as a people who are interested in helping everybody, who had close ties with Iran, who just before the revolution had Jimmy Carter toast Iran and the Shah as an island of stability in the Middle East, were stunned that people were out in the streets yelling death to America, that they were taking our people hostage, our people in the embassies. Shortly after that, we saw Lebanon explode, and again we saw the Marines killed, we saw Western embassies attacked. There were a series of hijackings, hostage-taking, and we came to encounter Islam and political Islam through headline events. And so for the 80s, the dominant reality was that political Islam or Islamic fundamentalism meant either revolutionary Islam, Iran's export of revolution, and that fear for the 80s, or it meant militant groups like the jihad group that assassinated Anwar Sadat, and the jihad groups that exist in other parts of the Middle East at that time. So Islam became equated with fundamentalism, fundamentalism with extremism and terrorism. The only exception was Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we had the happy warriors. These were mujahideen that we didn't have a problem with. This was the exceptional jihad. This was the okay jihad. Because in a sense, they were our guys fighting the Soviets. So it was a different kind of attitude. We may not have fully understood what was really going on in terms of the religious dimension and the dynamics there, but we knew that they were fighting for the right cause and against the right people. The 1990s gives us a slightly different picture. In the 1990s, the notion that Islamic fundamentalism or political Islam is simply reactionary, violent, terrorist gets tempered by the fact that we begin to see that there was also a quiet revolution taking place in many Muslim societies. That is that Islamic activism emerged both in terms of political and social activism in societies. At the end of the 80s and 90s, there were crises in the Muslim world. Bread riots, food riots, economies had failed. Governments cracked open the door. I used to say open the door. That has never happened in the Middle East or the Muslim world. They don't open the door to democracy. They don't open the door. They crack it open, and then they can slam it shut. But they cracked it open, and they held elections. And the stunning thing was that suddenly Islamist candidates and Islamic parties operating within the system above ground proved that they could emerge as the leading opposition. And indeed, in Algeria, it looked as if they would come to power. So now there was a whole new ballgame. For the 80s, it was political Islam to be feared, that it would come to power through bullets, and now it looked like ballots. And at the same time, Islam emerged as mainstream social activism. That is, you had Islamic groups founding hospitals and clinics and daycare centers, providing institutions of civil society that offered alternatives to government facilities, and in a way were a quiet critique of the government's inability to deliver. Now, at that time, Edward Jerejian was associated with a very important policy that came out. And in many ways, it's been associated with his name, and then subsequently with one of his successors, Robert Pelletreau. And this was a statement that basically said, and he could speak more to it when he speaks, that the United States has no problem with Islam, that the United States has no problem with Islamic movements, that they should be able to compete in the way that other movements, secular or religious, do, as long as they participate within the system and their use of the democratic process is not really to simply seize power through the democratic process. That is, as long as they're not people who believe in one man, one vote, one time. Later changed to one person, one vote, one time.
That's because my wife told me to do that.
Very good. It makes it a lot easier in later talks. But that position was put out there. But for governments in the region, this was a problem. Basically under cover of the Gulf War, in my view, we see after the Gulf War, many of the very governments that opened up the system closed down that system increasingly because they fear any opposition, let alone a religious opposition. Now, very briefly, what is the ideological world of Islamic fundamentalist movements? Mainstream movements basically say that Islam is a comprehensive way of life. Therefore, if there's one God and God's law governs all of creation, then it governs all of creation, not just personal life, but public life. And that Muslim weakness comes from straying from the path of God, and Muslim strength, as Muslims enjoyed for their first 10 centuries of existence, the Muslim community, can be gained by a return to Islam. And this becomes the grand struggle, the grand jihad, a struggle to re-implement Islam. For radicals or extremists, they go one step further. They basically say, implementing Islam is an imperative, it's God's commandment, therefore there's no choice. It's not an alternative. And we don't have time, we have to implement it immediately. And therefore, all Muslims have to be on board with regard to that agenda. And if they're not, they're unbelievers like everybody else, and subject to armed jihad or militant jihad, subject to battle, to fight, to be fought. They also argue that on political grounds, violence and terrorism are necessary because they basically say, look at our regimes. Our regimes do not tolerate opposition. Our regimes are anti-Islamic. They're authoritarian. Therefore, you can't work within the political process. And they say, look at America and the West. America and the West support our regimes for a variety of reasons, access to oil, etc. And so both regimes and the West become objects of warfare, objects of armed jihad. Now, briefly, what is jihad in Islam? Read my next book. No. What is jihad in Islam? Jihad generically means the struggle to be a good Muslim, the struggle to be a good Christian, the struggle to be a good Jew, to lead a virtuous life. But that struggle to be a good Muslim can be a struggle at a certain point where one is forced to defend oneself, the Muslim community, or indeed one's religion if under siege. And then one has the right to take up armed struggle. Okay. Now, as we'll see in a second, what bin Laden winds up doing is basically hijacking Islam and saying, but we are under siege. We're under siege from the regimes in the area. We're under siege from the West. And therefore, we have the obligation, not the option, the obligation to take up jihad. And you're either with us or you're against us. Whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jew, secularist, doesn't matter. Okay, what can we say then about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and why this is happening? How much time do I have? A little bit more. I like that. Good. Bin Laden goes from being the glorious mujahideen or mujahid, warrior in the war against the Soviet Union, to a terrorist. How does that happen? Well, it's always difficult to simply draw a bottom line on it, but one of the things we want to think about is that bin Laden went off to fight the good fight, as did a lot of Afghans, as did a lot of people from the Arab world who went to fight there and who then became called the Arab Afghans. They went off and they fought a holy war. And what did they become convinced of? And what did they see? That, my God, you could be successful. You could drive out the Soviets, and in many ways, some would argue, be the force that led to the unraveling of the Soviet Union internationally. Then bin Laden went back to the kingdom. Then came the Gulf War. Bin Laden's reaction to the Gulf War. His reaction particularly to the fact that the American military stayed in the Gulf. Then came the Intifada, his reaction to the Intifada. Bosnia, Kosovo, a whole list of grievances. Bin Laden, the son of a very wealthy man who had lived in mainstream society, well-educated, very pious, became convinced, and his first target was the kingdom. Became convinced of the un-Islamic nature of Saudi Arabia in permitting troops to come to Saudi Arabia and then permitting significant American and Western presence in the Gulf, and became convinced of the corruption of many of the regimes. And so he and others then, in a sense, resurrected their militant jihad. Now it became a global jihad. For bin Laden, what are his grievances? Well, it's easy. Look at his interviews on CNN, ABC, etc. And this is important. We ask the question, why do they hate us? The simple fact of it is that a significant majority of people in the Arab and the Muslim world have a deep and abiding anger at American foreign policy. They don't hate America. They don't hate Americans. Many of them deal with us, study here, do business with us. They're in every sector of society. But they don't like our foreign policy in the Arab and Muslim world. They regard our foreign policy as operating on a double standard. They basically say, you say that you believe in the promotion of democracy and human rights, but what happened after the Gulf War? You promoted every place but in our region. Who do you favor? You favor our authoritarian regimes. Remember, their main target is their own regime. We're the next target because we're seen as supporting the regime. Their main threat is to their own people. Their main threat is within their own societies. And so they look and they say, well, where's the double standard? They talk about the Arab-Israeli crisis. They particularly look at the intifada that's going on now. Remember that they see more than we do. We don't see a lot of international news until recently. We've cut back in recent years. But as a result of Al Jazeera and their own media and press, every day people in the Arab and Muslim world can watch the intifada unfolding, can watch what's going on in Chechnya, etc. And in the intifada, they see violence committed by both sides. They see terrorism committed by both sides. But they see a disproportionate firepower on one side, and that firepower often supported by American-made Apache helicopters and F-16s, etc. They look at how we went in gloriously and acquitted ourselves in Kosovo, but they say, where are you when it comes to Chechnya and Kashmir? Where are you when it comes to the sanctions in Iraq? And so what a bin Laden is able to do is to appeal to mainstream grievances, but now appeal to them insofar as for a radical fringe, anger becomes hatred. And so the movement, therefore, is not of protest, but becomes a movement of violence and terrorism. And this is what bin Laden is about. And what's important to remember is that he represents a phenomenon. Simply taking out bin Laden does not end the problem of global terrorism. That, in fact, there are substantive political and economic issues out there, foreign policy issues that will have to be addressed, not because one will be able to simply diffuse the threat, but what one wants to be able to do is to limit anti-Americanism, to limit it among the mainstream, and to limit the seedbed that allows the bin Ladens of the world to recruit. Because remember, those that they recruit are not only the oppressed. Those that they recruit are not only the oppressed, but they are people who have a good education, come from good backgrounds, but who are socially conscious and eventually radicalized. Think about the civil rights movement and think about the anti-war movement. Many of the people involved in those movements were among the oppressed, but others were bright, social conscience, religious people, got involved in the movement and stayed in the movement, operated nonviolently within the political process. But some became radicalized by their experience or the perception of the experience. And that's what the bin Ladens of the world feed off. See, they feed off legitimate grievances, but they play to those who begin to feel that they are hopelessly oppressed, or those who are not oppressed but involved in the movement and feel that the governments of their area are corrupt and that they are backed up by a superpower, and therefore they can strike out against them. So, in conclusion, what we have now is a very fragile coalition that reflects the very fragility of the region. Why are Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others worried, and Pakistan? Because these governments have a fragile relationship at home, and that affects their ability to deal in terms of the support for the coalition, and particularly when we start talking about bombing through Ramadan. And particularly when they hear voices coming out of Washington, not all, but at times in the past, voices talking about, well, we'll just widen this and we'll go after Iraq, maybe Iran, maybe Syria, or as one member of the Defense Department said 2 weeks ago, if there are movements in Southeast Asia, we may have to go into Southeast Asia. And so that concern of broadening the circle. Now, I think, the genius of our government, you talk about regimes, I was all ready to say the genius of our regime. The genius of our government so far in the early stages has been a proportionate focused strike. But the issue when you're looking at the Islamic world today will be, how much longer does this war go on? Many will be saying, we still don't see the hard evidence. And if the bombing continues, many will say, why is it necessary to continue the bombing for more weeks, 4 months, etc.? You have a country that's been bombed almost back into the Stone Age by its own people, and now this bombing can simply put it way back. Remember that Mary Robinson of the United Nations called for an end to the bombing a week or two ago on humanitarian grounds, because winter's coming and the impact on millions of people. And so that's going to be a very critical, it seems to me, point. How the United States and its coalition, its fragile coalition, proceeds from here on in. How does it wind up cobbling together a global war on terrorism, which addresses not only the military and the economic side, but also addresses the public diplomacy side, and particularly the kinds of core issues that require that we not only look at our own foreign policy, but that we get governments in the region to take a look at their foreign policies. We see the Secretary of State pushing India as well as Pakistan on Kashmir. We see him pushing Mr. Sharon as well as Mr. Arafat. And whether or not our government can sustain that kind of move, and whether or not there can be some progress on that front, I think will be very critical in terms of the developments in the region, and particularly in terms of Islamic fundamentalism itself. That is, whether or not that small minority of radical groups is able to draw off and radicalize other Islamic movements that right now operate in the mainstream of society, but that if their regimes become more authoritarian, and if this war is not prosecuted in a focused way, could lead to a clash of civilizations, something that I do not necessarily believe in or like, but I think can be a risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Esposito. Mark Ellis is University Professor of American and Jewish Studies at Baylor University, where he directs the Center for American and Jewish Studies, which is devoted to integrating Jewish studies into the tapestry of Baylor University, which historically has not had a great deal of Jewish studies, and participating in the national and international discussions on ecumenism, religious pluralism, Jewish theology, philosophy, identity, the Holocaust, and the future of Israel-Palestine. Professor Ellis is often described as a Jewish liberation theologian. His credentials in the field of liberation theology are impressive. Before coming to Baylor, he spent 15 years at the Maryknoll School of Theology, where he founded and directed the Institute for Justice and Peace, and worked with such well-known figures of liberation theology as Gustavo Gutierrez, Rosemary Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, James Cone, Daniel and Philip Berrigan, Muhammad Hallaj, Johann Metz, Robert McAfee Brown, and Gregory Baum. From 1995 to 1998, immediately before coming to Baylor, Professor Ellis was a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions and a visiting scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. He's also served as a consultant to the Committee to Combat Racism of the World Council of Churches and as a member of the Steering Committee of the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Consultation of the American Academy of Religion. Professor Ellis has authored 10 books and 3 collections of essays. These include Faithfulness in an Age of Holocaust, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, The Renewal of Palestine in the Jewish Imagination, Ending Auschwitz, The Future of Jewish and Christian Life, Unholy Alliance, Religion and Atrocity in Our Time, and O Jerusalem, The Contested Failure of the Jewish Covenant. His latest book, Practicing Exile, The Religious Odyssey of an American Jew, will be published later this year by Fortress Press. Professor Ellis recently joined the editorial board of the Jewish progressive journal Tikkun. By his own ready acknowledgement, Mark Ellis is a controversial writer and thinker. By the acknowledgement of any who read his works, he has the capacity, as one reviewer put it, to metaphorically take you by the shoulders and shake you. I've been reading his books, and that assessment is no exaggeration. Holocaust theologian Richard Rubinstein has said of him, a representative of neither the Jewish nor the Christian mainstream, Mark Ellis is nevertheless one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of our generation. Please welcome Professor Mark Ellis.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the Baker Institute. After September 11th, we have been focusing on religious extremism. I want to focus on a deeper level of the question of Israel-Palestine. My argument is simple and complex at the same time. I believe that Jewish fundamentalism is not the problem in the Middle East. And so I will speak tonight on the subject settlers, state policy, and the narrative of innocence. It is within the liberal and right-wing nationalist narrative in Israel and the United States that Jewish fundamentalism comes into play. Shortly after the conclusion of the 1967 war, Jewish fundamentalism, already on the sidelines, prepared for a major role in the future of Israel. If the Holocaust was the nadir of Jewish history, wasn't the taking of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria the beginning of redemption? Jewish zealots took the celebratory mood felt by Jews around the world after the 1967 victory and conquering of Jerusalem as a sign from God that redemption was near. Though clothed in religious rhetoric, the new Jewish settlers saw these opportunities as a breakthrough in the creation of Israel rather than a break with Israeli history. After all, the creation of Israel was through a process of settlement. The expansion of Israel after the 1967 war was a continuation of that process. Those Jews who wanted no part of settlements in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas saw the victory of Israel in the war as necessary and a negotiated settlement that would return the territories as imminent. The religiously motivated worked within the system of Israeli politics to place their new settlement ideas in the context of Jewish history and an evolving history of the Israeli state. Appeal could be made on a variety of levels without involving diverse constituencies in overt religious ideology. Ordinary Israelis could find expanded economic and housing possibilities in settlements. Secular nationalists could use the religious fervor of the settlers to accomplish their goal of an expanded state. Security concerns that Israel was too small to defend itself could be used to argue for expansion. So, the forces of religious zeal were unleashed within a broader spectrum of war, occupation, and state policies of consolidation and expansion. To see the subsequent decades of Israeli history only or even primarily within the context of Jewish fundamentalism is to miss the larger story. To understand the combination of politics, ideology, and religion that intersect in the expanded state of Israel, we need a broader concept than Jewish fundamentalism. I suggest we use the term settler Judaism. because it encompasses the diverse aspects of Israeli and American Jewish life that have led to the present impasse. Settler Judaism brings together the radical right, religious fundamentalism, and liberal politics into a coherent, if unexpected, framework of overt and covert sensibilities that increasingly define Israeli and American Jewry. To analyze settler Judaism, we begin with 4 points of analysis. First, the settlements themselves, who formed them and who lives within them. Second, Barak's, quote, generous offer to the Palestinians as a way of demonstrating the continuing involvement of the Israeli government in the settlement process. Third, Sharon's proposal for the final settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian question. And fourth, the recent campaign by major Jewish organizations to silence dissent with regard to these policies during the recent Palestinian uprising. My overall thesis is as follows. Settler Judaism is alive and well today. Its strength is diverse with politics, policies, and narratives rather than religious fundamentalism at its center. Rather than religious fundamentalism, it is the combination of mostly moderate and liberal Jews in Israel and America with American foreign policy that allows settler Judaism to flourish in the 21st century. Without this combination, religious fundamentalism would be held by a small minority of Jews, but with little or no political power. First, according to Avishai Margalit, the Schulman professor of philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, with respect to the Jewish settlements, the West Bank is divided into 3 parts, or 3 long strips of land. The first strip of settlements was established in the Jordan Valley after the 1967 war and just before the War of October 1973. They were developed by traditional labor Zionist settlement institutions, the kibbutz and moshav movements, which are liberal, socialist, secular, non, and even anti-religious. The second strip is further west in the Jordan Valley and was pioneered by Gush Emunun, the Bloc of the Faithful, a Jewish messianic movement. These settlements were a form of resistance to the 1967 Alon Plan, a plan that sought to avoid settlements near Palestinian population centers in the West Bank. For this movement, not settling near these centers meant conceding these areas in any future agreements. Interestingly, these religious settlements had many and diverse allies, those identified with the political right, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and Ariel Sharon, but also those identified with liberal politics, Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. Both conservative and liberal politicians wanted to destroy the Alon Plan and share joint control over the entire West Bank with Jordan. Now, most settlers live in the third strip, closest to the pre-1967 border of Israel. 3 types of settlers can be identified here. Those seeking a better quality of life, the economically needy, those who are both needy and ultra-Orthodox. As Margalit points out, quote, what the Palestinians find most worrying is the increase of over 50% in the number of housing units as well as the settler population since the Oslo agreements in September 1993. Indeed, since 1993, Israeli statistics show an increase of the settler population at about 8% a year, rising from 116,000 in the West Bank and Gaza to over 200,000 settlers at the beginning of the Second Intifada in September 2000. If you add the number of Jews who live in the areas of Jerusalem annexed after the 1967 war, then the number of settlers increases by another 210,000 Jewish Israelis. Palestinians consider that there are over 400,000 Jewish settlers. Second, Barak's, quote, generous offer has been more often asserted than analyzed. it is instructive to see Barak's offer within a continuity of Israeli policy since 1967. In a paper delivered at the Center for International Studies at the University of Delaware, Sarah Roy, research associate at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, offered the following analysis. Because Roy is succinct in her analysis, I will quote her at length. 2 quotes. First, by the time of the Camp David summit in July 2000, there were several processes taking place simultaneously and superimposed on each other. 1, the steady confiscation of Arab lands in the West Bank and Gaza. 2, the accelerated expansion of Israeli settlements and the construction of new settlements on confiscated lands, bisecting them. 3, the near doubling of the settler population to 200,000 in 10 years, a population that is hostile, armed, and empowered, with total freedom of movement and all the privileges of Israeli citizenship. 4, the division of the West Bank and Gaza strips into cantons, or enclaves, disconnected from each other by territories under the control of Israel, which directly result from the terms of the Oslo Agreement. 5, the paving of 250 miles of bypass roads onto confiscated lands that run north-south and east-west, creating a grid that further bisects and encircles Palestinian areas, producing the 227 enclaves referred to by Amnesty International. 6, the institutionalization of closure policy, which limits, restricts, and at times totally prohibits the movement of Arab people and goods, locking them into the enclave structure created by the Oslo Accords and wreaking havoc with their economy. And finally, the construction of hundreds of checkpoints and barricades throughout the West Bank designed to control and further restrict the movement of Palestinians. Roy continues, 2nd quote, Barak's 2000 budget allocated $6.5 million for the construction of bypass roads, $30 million for settlement expansion, and $51 million for the confiscation of Palestinian lands, among other categories. According to the Israeli group Peace Now, the Barak administration issued permits for the construction of 3,575 new settlement homes and earmarked $500 million for settlements in its 2001 budget. According to official data from Israel's housing ministry, Barak's government began construction of 1,943 housing units in the West Bank and Gaza in 2000, the largest number in any year since 1992. During the final quarter of 2000, as the Al-Aqsa Intifada intensified, the Barak government began work on 954 housing units alone, up from 368 during the last quarter of 1999. End of quote. 3, rather than departing in a fundamental way, Sharon continues Barak's sensibility. In fact, Sharon is part of the consensus of Israeli politics to the right, but well within that consensus. As recently reported in the New York Times, Sharon's understanding of a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians conforms to his earlier sensibilities and the consensus of previous Israeli administrations. In fact, Sharon seeks to implement a final settlement with the Palestinians, the map of an expanded state of Israel that he, with others, helped to create. This map is intriguing. According to the Times, Sharon wants to retain the West Bank land in 2 security zones. These zones would comprise 2 north to south strips that would, quote, bracket Palestinian areas like the sides of a ladder, end of quote. The western zone, whose width would be 3 to 6 miles, would parallel that edge of the West Bank, the same area where Sharon oversaw the building of settlements over 20 years ago. The second zone would run through the Rift Valley just west of the Jordan River. This second zone, facing Jordan and beyond it Iraq, would be 9 to 12 miles wide. Between the security zones would run Israeli roads that the Times article refers to as, quotes, rungs of the ladder. According to the Times, the effect of the completed ladder would be the following, quote, "This Israeli security system would not only consume swaths of land Mr. Arafat expected to govern, it would also wall off separate areas of the Palestinian state." Ron Pundak, an architect of the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords, voices the fears of Palestinians, quote, "The fear is that the idea behind an Israeli interim agreement is to create facts on the ground and transform the interim into the permanent," end of quote. Yet his fears betray a naivete. These are the facts on the ground that have been built over the years through agreements, uprisings, and truces. Negotiating future agreements would have to roll back in a significant way Israel's advance. What power is there to force such a rollback? Fourth, the American Jewish establishment, with minor exceptions, seeks to protect Israel from the negative images resulting from the Palestinian resistance to these facts and the Israeli repression of that resistance. Since the beginning of this intifada in September 2000, American Jewish groups have paid for full-page statements in major newspapers around the United States. These statements call for Jewish unity and unqualified support of the State of Israel. An example of these statements appeared in the Times recently. The text reads as follows, quote, "Be heard. You could sit home and worry silently about the situation, or you could stand together with Israel and make your voice heard. Come to the solidarity rally for Israel." With the slogan, "Israel now and forever," the statement had the following co-sponsors: United Jewish Communities Federation of North America, UJA Federation of New York, Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, Jewish Council for Public Affairs, Central Conference of American Rabbis, Rabbinical Assembly, Rabbinical Council of America, Union of American Hebrew Congregations, in short, all the major Jewish organizations in the United States. All of them are moderate and liberal, not one of them Jewish fundamentalist. And not surprising, the honorary chairman of the event was Elie Wiesel. At a similar rally in October 2000, more than a month into the Intifada, Wiesel addressed his remarks to President Clinton, stating that Jews stand by Israel in the present crisis, quote, imposed on her by the intransience of Yasser Arafat. Wiesel identifies himself as one who rejects, quote, hatred and fanaticism. For Wiesel, those who consider peace as the, quote, noblest of efforts have no choice but to finally recognize that Arafat is, quote, ignorant, devious, and unworthy of trust. After all, Arafat has rejected, quote, the unprecedented generous territorial concessions, end of quote, offered by Barak. Quote, "I accuse him of being morally weak, politically short-sighted, and an obstacle to peace," Wiesel said. "I accuse him of murdering the hopes of an entire generation, his and ours," end of quote. But what is interesting in Wiesel's remarks is what he does not say or refer to. Nowhere is the map of Israel-Palestine, as discussed in the New York Times, referred to. In Wiesel's narrative, settlements do not exist, nor do bypass roads or security zones that in Barak and Sharon's plans continue to exist and in fact are consolidated. Wiesel's narrative does include the mention of the Jewish attachment to Jerusalem, but in a way that again mystifies its existence rather than explains its politicized nature. Quote, "Under Israel's sovereignty, Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike could pray without fear in Jerusalem," Wiesel asserts. Jerusalem is, quote, "our capital, the center of Jewish history." Wiesel continues, quote, "A Jew may be far from Jerusalem, but not without Jerusalem. Though a Jew may not live in Jerusalem, Jerusalem lives inside of him," end of quote. No mention is made of either the attempt to force Palestinians to leave Jerusalem, nor the overall policies of remaking Jerusalem, especially the Old City, in Jewish and Israeli ways. The strong and equally claimed attachment of Palestinians and Islam to Jerusalem goes without mention. The possibility of Israel and Palestine claiming Jerusalem as a joint capital, a possibility envisioned by Palestinians and more than a few Jews inside and outside of Israel, is similarly unmentioned. Even the claim of worship without fear in Jerusalem is dubious. Since the signing of the Oslo agreements, a majority of time has seen Palestinians outside of Jerusalem restricted in their movements. The possibility of prayer in the mosque has been restricted by the same map and occupation that Wiesel fails to mention. Wiesel has been a major voice in the evolving narrative in America that supports Israel. He is religious, but hardly in a fundamentalist way. In fact, he is moderate. His voice is a liberal religious voice. A prime mover in Holocaust remembrance, exemplified in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. By emphasizing the Holocaust as the center of Jewish history and Israel as the response to the Holocaust, he narrates Jewish history as innocent, in our suffering innocent, and in our empowerment as innocent. This narrative has the map of the Holocaust at the center, but the map of Israel, especially the expanded state of Israel from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River, is absent. Therefore, to criticize Israeli policies, to place the map of Israel-Palestine as it is for Wiesel and many Jews to assault the Jewish people and to assault the memory of the Holocaust. The leaders of this, quote, assault are the Palestinians, who rather than fighting for their rights in their land are seen as the latest incarnation of European anti-Semites. One can recall Begin's reference to the Palestinians as Nazis and Arafat as the new Hitler. And recently, Sharon's reflection on the war against terrorism, reflecting on the Munich Agreement that Israel would not be left alone and dismembered. If there is any critique of Jewish life, it is laid on some exceptional Jewish extremists, Jewish fundamentalists. The quote, there are extremists on both sides. But no serious critique of state power, settlement policy, bypass roads, American foreign policy is possible. Because of the Holocaust, we are innocent. We are unaccountable to the world. The world is against us. My conclusion. There is no question that Jewish fundamentalism, or better stated, Jewish messianism, has grown over the last decades, and that the idea that there is a greater land of Israel, from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River, has struck a responsive chord among Jewish nationalists who are not religious, and even among Jewish Americans who are not messianists or overt nationalists. The belief that the land of Israel was promised to the Jews by God is certainly part of the biblical witness. The sense that Israel might be a religious response to the Holocaust, may be part of an evolving plan of redemption, is credible within certain understandings of Jewish history. There is absolutely no point in asserting that those who hold to these beliefs are un-Jewish, not Jewish, or somehow outside the Jewish tradition. In my encounters with right-wing nationalists and Jewish messianists, I have been startled, dismayed, horrified. I have even become physically ill. They represent a form of Judaism and Jewish life that is completely foreign to me. And yet I have come to believe that they represent the future of Jewish life. In my own reflection, I have come to see this future as a challenge to Jews everywhere. I leave you with these questions. What does it mean to be Jewish after the Holocaust? What does it mean to be Jewish after the expanded state of Israel? What does it mean to be Jewish after the Holocaust and after Israel? With the map of Israel-Palestine as it is, what does the call for Jewish unity mean? Does this unity cover over injustice? We certainly can believe whatever we want, but with Jewish power in the United States and Israel, can we continue to assert an unaccountability for our actions as if we are weak and helpless, as if the trains are still departing for Auschwitz, as if the emergency years after the Holocaust continue? What does God's promise, what does our chosenness, what does our covenant mean for Jews today in our world? Can our, quote, redemption be redemption when others are suffering? Or does the suffering of others call into question our redemption? The choice is before us as a people. It is too easy to say them, Jewish fundamentalist. In reality, the problem is also us.
In the current climate, no one doubts that Islamic fundamentalism plays a significant role in the Middle East, and the role of Jewish fundamentalism has been less noted, and as Professor Ellis has contended, perhaps plays a less significant role than some have contended. But Christian fundamentalism, Middle East, have we included consideration of Christian fundamentalism just to round out the set this evening? Or does it play a role worth noting? Our next speaker is well qualified to shed light on another important dimension of this tangled interaction of religious forces. Dr. Timothy Weber, a native Californian, earned his BA in history at UCLA and then attended Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, the leading graduate school in evangelical Christian circles. After completing his degree at Fuller, he attended the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he received his PhD in church history, studying there with Martin Marty, perhaps America's leading authority on almost everything pertaining to church history and any other aspects of religion, including religious fundamentalism. Dr. Weber then joined the faculty at Denver Seminary, where he taught for 16 years, and while at Denver served also as pastor of Heritage Baptist Church in Aurora, Colorado. In 1992, he became the David T. Porter Professor of Church History at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where he served until January 1997, at which time he moved to Northern Theological Seminary in Illinois, near Chicago, to become Dean of the Seminary and Professor of Church History. Dr. Weber's research and writing have dealt primarily with American religious and general church history, Christian millennial movements, and American evangelicalism and fundamentalism. As a part of that research, he has given detailed attention to the significant support provided to Israel by conservative Christian groups in this country. If you're not familiar with that story, I think you will be surprised. Please welcome Dr. Timothy Weber.
I'm delighted to be here tonight. It's an honor to be included in this program. In America, Christian fundamentalism emerged in the early 20th century out of the conviction that modernity was having a disastrous effect on morality, family life, theology, and the place of the churches in the broader culture. Instead of taking their grievances to the street or assassinating modernist perpetrators, these rather traditional Christians use more acceptable means to fight against evolution in the schools, theological liberalism in the churches, and the growing secularization of American life. They lost on all three counts. After they did lose, most of them withdrew into their own subculture. They created their own churches and publishing houses and schools and missionary agencies. Despite the fact that the media predicted their soon demise after the Scopes monkey trial of 1925, American fundamentalism has prospered to the present day. Of special interest to us tonight is the involvement of fundamentalists, American Christian fundamentalists, in the politics of the Middle East. No one in the U.S. outdoes American Christian fundamentalists in their support of Israel, not even Jews. Israeli prime ministers have said so, and since Menachem Begin, all Israeli leaders have seen American fundamentalists as important shapers of American foreign policy toward Israel. What many people do not understand is that most fundamentalists support Israel because they believe it will play a key role in events leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. In the history of Christianity are many schools of interpretation concerning prophecies about the end of the world. In the 18th century, many British Christians began to speculate about the restoration of a Jewish state before the return of Christ. In about 1830, an Englishman named John Nelson Darby incorporated this view into his own new interpretation of biblical prophecy, called dispensationalism, after his dividing up of all biblical and subsequent history into eras or dispensations. The hermeneutic of dispensationalism is complicated. I will not speak of it now. Suffice it here to say that dispensationalists look at the Bible as a huge jigsaw puzzle of prophecy. If you know how to work the texts, you can discover an enormously complicated and detailed scenario of what's going to happen in the future before Jesus comes. Now, Darby preached his message first in Great Britain, then came to America after the Civil War. He worked existing church networks until his views spread and became in the 20th century at the core of the new fundamentalist movement in America. This movement spreads today and is perpetuated by a host of factors, by the enduring Scofield Reference Bible, published first in 1909, and then scores of Bible institutes, colleges, and seminaries, an army of cable TV preachers and local church preachers, and a flood of popular literature, including Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, which was the best-selling book, bar none, in the 1970s, and the current rage in fiction. I think it's up to 9 volumes of the Left Behind series, which tells the story of what's going to happen at the end. Now, what is this expected scenario that dispensationalist fundamentalists predict? And how does it impact current politics? For 150 years, dispensationalists have been teaching the following. History is on a downward slope to its end. There will be wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, natural disasters, famines, and pestilence. Organized religion will become apostate, immorality will increase, anarchy will bring the nations to the verge of collapse. Persecution of God's people will become very obvious. But that is only the beginning, the prelude to even worse times. Shortly before the return of Christ, the nations will gather for war in the Middle East against a restored Jewish state. Then the end will come. Now, dispensationalists take prophecies from Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation, and they predict that at the end there will be a northern confederacy, usually identified as Russia and her allies, that will join forces with certain kings of the south, most recently identified as an Arab-Muslim coalition. They will launch a well-coordinated attack on Israel to destroy it once and for all. Just as it appears that Israel is doomed, God intervenes and destroys both invading armies. Still shaky, Israel makes a pact of peace with a new leader on the scene, the head of a 10-nation European confederation, a kind of revived Roman Empire. After 3.5 years of peace, this new leader reveals himself to be the Antichrist. He comes to a restored temple in Jerusalem. He declares himself to be God. He demands worship and then launches a genocidal war on all who do not comply. Well, that will prompt an invasion from the east. A 200 million man army under the kings of the east. When forces of east and west converge on the plain of Jezreel, northwest of Jerusalem, the battle of Armageddon will be on. Well, at that point, Jesus Christ returns, breaks through the clouds with his warrior saints, destroys the armies gathered, and then the Jews who survive turn to him finally, at long last, as their Messiah. King Jesus will then set up his throne in Jerusalem, just down the street from a restored temple where Jewish priests practice the ancient blood sacrifices. And there he reigns in peace and justice for 1,000 years. In short, God's whole program depends on getting a Jewish state restored and preserved in the Middle East. Well, up until the 1980s, most dispensationalists didn't think they had to do anything about this scenario to have it happen. In fact, by God's grace, they didn't even think they would be here when it happened. Before any end times prophecies are fulfilled, Jesus will make a stealth return to earth to rapture his saints to heaven. It is as though God has given dispensationalists bleacher seats on history's 50-yard line and told them exactly how the end game would be played and how it would come out. They could sit there watching the various players assemble on the field, but they will be leaving the stadium before the whistle blows and the actual game begins. As a result, dispensationalists have always felt a sense of power because they knew what was going to happen, and a sense of relief because they wouldn't be here to suffer along with everybody else. Well, for most of the 20th century, at least until the middle part, most dispensationalists remained in the bleachers, content to watch the players assemble on the field. They read the Bible with one hand and the newspaper with the other, looking for signs of the times. They noted the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I and the British Balfour Declaration, which declared its commitment to a Jewish state in Palestine. They announced that the redrawing of the map of Europe after the Great War was a prelude to this revived Roman Empire that they expected. They watched the rise of communism, fascism, and anti-Semitism and fit them into their scenario. They speculated that Mussolini and a whole host of others might be the expected Antichrist. And now and then they guessed at a date for when all this might happen. Of course, nothing energized this community more than the reestablishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Dispensationalists hailed its founding as the most significant prophetic event of the age, the undeniable proof that they had been reading the Bible correctly. The times of the Gentiles was over. Could the return of Christ be far behind? Of course, the map of the State of Israel in 1948 didn't quite make it, didn't conform to their expectations. It was a mere sliver of land, a patchwork of territory that didn't conform in any way to the expected expanded version of Israel like that under Kings David and Solomon. From the bleachers, dispensationalists pointed out that Israel needed to expand before the end game could begin. So when Israelis took control of Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, fundamentalists were happy, and they said that's going in the right direction, but there's even more territory that needs to be taken. Now that Israel had the land, it had to keep it until Jesus came. Now, dispensationalists supported the expansion of Israel on prophetic grounds and saw no need to consider the claims of the Palestinians, who in their view had no right to the Holy Land at all. Dispensationalists understood the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not in terms of international law or the rights of self-determination, but as a modern expression of the ancient biblical rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael. God had made it clear in the Bible that the chosen people were reckoned through Isaac, not Ishmael. The flow of salvation history moved in one direction, not two. Thus, dispensationalists did not see any way to reconcile the two warring parties. The divine die was cast. Jews win, Palestinians lose. Even so, something new happened in the 1980s. For the first time, dispensationalists felt the need to leave the bleachers in order to assist certain players on the field, and thereby shape the future that they envisioned. Three factors contributed to this explosion of fundamentalist activism. First, the rise of the new Christian right in the late 70s and early 80s. Two, the realization by Israeli leaders and their American Jewish supporters that these fundamentalists were fiercely pro-Israel and potentially powerful allies. And three, the growing U.S. government's pressure on Israel to trade land for peace. Now, the 80s made for some very strange bedfellows in American politics. When fundamentalists broke ranks with Jimmy Carter in 1977 because he called for a Palestinian homeland, the new Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and his Likud party saw in these fundamentalists a powerful potential ally. Unlike the secular Labor Party, Likud was a coalition of orthodox religious parties and hardline military leaders who claimed that the Bible guaranteed Israel's right to all of Palestinian land. Dispensationalist Jerry Falwell and Prime Minister Begin seemed to be made for each other. Soon the religious right and the pro-Israel lobby were working side by side. American Jewish organizations like the American Israel Political Affairs Committee and even the Anti-Defamation League built bridges to the new Christian right. The Israeli Ministry of Tourism began sponsoring all expenses-paid trips to Israel for fundamentalist pastors and religious leaders in hopes that they would return to the Holy Land with tour groups of their own. Soon the airport in Tel Aviv was jammed with American fundamentalists who came to walk where Jesus walked and get the Israeli spin on the Palestinian conflict. Tour groups led by celebrity televangelists got VIP treatment in Israel, including briefings by Israeli cabinet ministers, no less. Prophecy pundit Hal Lindsey claimed to have ready access to Israeli political and military leaders who were anxious about dispensationalism's take, anxious to know, curious about dispensationalism's take on Israel's future prospects. The religious right and pro-Israel lobby had a special friend in Ronald Reagan, who himself held vague notions about the prophetic significance of Israel and the approaching Battle of Armageddon. When Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear plant in 1981 and invaded southern Lebanon in 1982, Likud leaders knew that they could count on Reagan and the fundamentalists. Dispensationalist leaders took out ads in major newspapers in support of the Israeli actions. In one such ad were found the following words: "The time has come for evangelical Christians to affirm their belief in biblical prophecy and Israel's divine right to the land." we would view with grave concern any effort to carve out of the Jewish homeland another nation or political entity. Fundamentalists organized to support Israel. They circulated petitions, sponsored prayer breakfasts, and political rallies. Falwell claimed that he could mobilize 200,000 conservative Christian pastors and 70 million lay people to lobby the U.S. Congress. Such figures were obviously inflated for political effect, but the Likud leaders knew that Falwell's heart was in the right place. When Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996, Falwell introduced him to a number of new Christian right leaders. For obvious reasons, the prime minister preferred such people to Bill Clinton. On his trips to the U.S., Netanyahu usually conferred with them before he went to the White House. On one such occasion in April 1998, he told nearly 3,000 supporters from the religious right gathered at a Voices United for Israel conference in Washington, "We have no greater friends and allies than the people sitting in this room." Now, none of these things escaped the news media, but often coming in under their radar was the locally based, direct hands-on support that American fundamentalists were giving to Israeli settlements. On one level, fundamentalist involvement looked humanitarian. For example, a Tulsa-based organization called Bridges for Peace runs something called Operation Ezra, which distributes food, blankets, home repair items, and school supplies to newly arrived Jewish immigrants. But the organization's real motivation was telegraphed in one of its ads. Don't just read about prophecy when you can be part of it. A similar organization is Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, founded in the mid-90s by a Colorado Springs businessman who felt that the Israeli government was not giving the kind of support it should to the Israeli settlements. His idea was to put together Christian fundamentalist congregations with individual Jewish settlements on the West Bank. And he did so to the tune of 50 communities. Some of these congregations have poured a lot of money and a lot of supplies into these communities to give them the support that they felt the Israeli government was not giving them. A final and slightly different example of this cooperation is the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which is run by Chicago Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, whose On Wings of Eagles project raises money to help Jews from the former Soviet Union emigrate to Israel. Eckstein runs his infomercials on cable Christian TV stations, knowing that believers in Bible prophecy have a vested interest in getting as many Jews as possible back to the Holy Land before the end times. Quite visible in the fellowship's promotions are leaders of the new Christian right, such as Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Gary Bauer, Charles Colson, William Bennett, Ronald Reagan, and Pat Boone. Such Jewish Christian fundamentalist connections are not without their tensions. It is tough to maintain a religious coalition when one side is actively trying to convert the other. Christian fundamentalists chafe under the Israeli government's restrictions on missionary work. And many Jews are irritated by the Christians' prophetic views that Jews will experience their worst Holocaust at the hands of the Antichrist and then will turn to Jesus, finally. Rabbi James Rudin, Interreligious Affairs Director of the American Jewish Committee, complains, quote, that some of the very same people who are the most supportive of the state of Israel and its security and well-being don't see Judaism as a full and valid religion. It's like Israel see, Jews no, unquote. He's also critical of Jews who turn a deaf ear to the fundamentalist views on prophecy in order to gain more allies for Israel. Quote, many American Jews will say, any port in a storm. If they support Israel, don't worry too much about the apocalypse. But the majority of Jews in the pro-Israel lobby do not seem to be worried about this problem and are happy to have the fundamentalists on their side. Well, has anything changed since September 11? Not much. In a rare display of reticence, the Bible teachers are slow to pronounce the prophetic significance of the attack in New York and the ensuing war on terrorism, other than to say that they add heat to the world's growing unrest. The reason is rooted in the simple fact that dispensationalists have never been able to find the United States in Bible prophecy. They believe that the end times players are Europeans, Russians, Arabs, Chinese, and Israelis. So America is not found on their prophecy charts or battle maps. During the 70s, Hal Lindsey concluded that America will be a second-rate power by the end, done in by its own moral corruptions or possibly a nuclear attack. Other prophecy pundits are not so sure. Under current conditions, such views are nearly unthinkable. After all, fundamentalists are patriots too. One curious wrinkle in their present analysis stems from their past teaching that as long as the United States stood by Israel, God will protect it. The guarantee is straight out of the Bible. God to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. So what happened to God's umbrella of protection? As every Bible reader knows, God both protects and judges. Shortly after the attack, Jerry Falwell appeared as a guest on Pat Robertson's 700 Club. When asked how such a thing could happen, he leveled a broadside. Quote, I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped that happen. Later on, he apologized, saying that he knew that the terrorists were ultimately to blame. In his first analysis, however, we hear Falwell the fundamentalist loud and clear. American fundamentalists have a long tradition of condemning the sins of modernity. God is not pleased with the perversions of modern life, and sooner or later God will have the last word. On this, American fundamentalists are sure. But what has not yet occurred to them is that they may be contributing to the end game that they predict but believe they will be able to avoid. In short, do they mind that their prophecies may be self-fulfilling? And here's my conclusion. Probably not. They think they have no choice but to cooperate with the prophesied plans of God. So supporting Israel is the right and only thing to do. But when they force the complicated issues in the Middle East through the tight grid of their prophetic interpretations, they seem to lose the ability to think critically and ethically about what is really going on there. Does believing in Bible prophecy absolve them of grappling with issues of right and wrong? Does knowing how everything is going to turn out justify turning a blind eye to injustice? Do the ends justify the means just because the ends have been prophesied? Such questions do not get asked in fundamentalist circles. Dispensationalist fundamentalists have scoffed at every attempt to bring peace to the Middle East. In response to the 1979 Camp David Accords, Falwell said, in spite of the rosy and utterly unrealistic expectations by our government, this treaty will not be a lasting treaty. You and I know that there's not going to be any real peace in the Middle East until the Lord Jesus sits down upon the throne of David in Jerusalem. Well, maybe so, but the question is, what are Christian fundamentalists supposed to do in the meantime? Their own history proves that they have not always read the signs of the times correctly. Their prophecy teachers have often been surprised by history. The Gulf War immediately comes to mind. They have misidentified Antichrist and miscalculated dates for the second coming time after time. In light of their spotty record, they might do well to be more tentative about their views, to seek a more constructive role in the Middle East. As their prophecies make clear, the world is and will be a dangerous place. September 11 is a grim reminder that it is their world too, one that they and their children will have to live in until Jesus comes.
Several years ago, I had the good fortune to be on the search committee for the first director of the Baker Institute. And Edward Jerejian was actually the first person we interviewed, and all of us were just blown away by what a wonderful choice he would be for this position, although we weren't sure he could ever be persuaded to take it. One of the questions that was asked of him in one of the meetings was, do you think you would be able to deal with professors? And he said, let me remind you of the position I now hold. More recently, in the aftermath of September 11th, the Houston Chronicle said that Edward Jerejian was everybody's most desired dinner party in these days. And not everybody can have dinner with him, but you can catch him on television pretty much every day, it seems. Tonight we have the opportunity to not only to recognize the marvelous work he has done over the years here at the Baker Institute, but to be able to listen to him speak about his own work in that area and to give us the inside view of a diplomat whose role has been absolutely crucial in advising the United States government on these sensitive issues. Ambassador Jerejian.
Thank you very much, Bill. What Bill didn't specify is that during that search interview, I did go a little beyond that. I said, my God, can I deal with the faculty? I've been dealing with the Arabs and Israelis for 25 years. But one faculty member said, yes, but we're worse. I then immediately brought him on as my Associate Director for Academic Affairs, Professor Stoll. What I'd like to do tonight, and I know the time is going on a bit late, as Bill said, I'd like to give you a little recent historic insight from the point of view of a policy person in the government on the phenomenon we're facing, especially since September 11th, and to try to put it in some perspective. And at one point, and the only real point I want to make tonight, is that this is not a new war on terrorism. It is an extremely important and dangerous phase of the campaign against global terrorism, but this is not a new war. And I will try to explain this by this vignette I'm going to give you of what John Esposito mentioned in the early 1990s when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs. And we were faced with a series of phenomena that we were grappling with. First was the collapse of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union. We'd lost our enemy. And so there was a great deal of debate and searching as to, after the fall of communism, what is the next ism that the United States must confront. And in many ways, we define, or nations define themselves by their enemies. And there are several schools of thought, as you well know, and John mentioned Sam Huntington from Harvard and the Clash of Civilizations. And John and I think, see eye to eye on Sam Huntington's thesis is quite faulty. And what the Jesuits taught us at Georgetown University is the fallacy of composition. That is, if you take part of a phenomenon and then make it the whole phenomenon, there's something wrong there. And what Sam Huntington very deftly did was to play on the extremist fringes of culture and religion and make it into an overarching thesis, which simply misinforms, I believe, more than it illuminates our current situation, although he is often quoted. Now, let me go to this period in 1990. We elaborated a policy approach toward the Muslim world, which became the official position in both the Bush and Clinton administrations and was most recently reiterated by the present Assistant Secretary of State, Bill Burns, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Now, the major points of that initial approach that we enunciated in 1992, was as follows. The United States government does not view Islam as the next ism confronting the West or threatening world peace. That is a simplistic response to a complex reality. Further, such a perception plays into the hands of the extremists. In fact, in 1995, President Hashemi Rafsanjani, on the 16th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, claimed that, quote, the West, and particularly the United States, wants to confront Islamic fundamentalism the same way they challenge communism. It is a mistaken comparison and a policy that will only strengthen the movement, unquote. The next point we made was that the Cold War is not being replaced with a new competition between Islam and the West. The Crusades have been over for a long time. Americans recognize Islam as one of the world's great faiths. It is practiced on every continent. It counts among its adherents millions of citizens of the United States. As Westerners, we acknowledge Islam as a historic civilizing force among the many that have influenced and enriched our culture. Throughout the Middle East and North Africa, we see groups or movements seeking to reform their societies in keeping with Islamic ideals. There is considerable diversity in how these ideals are expressed. Of the nearly 1 billion Muslims in the world, more than half live outside the Arab world and differ linguistically, ethnically, racially, and culturally. There are large Muslim populations in South and Southeast Asia, China, Africa. How many Americans realize that Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world? How many Americans realize that one of the largest Muslim populations are in India? The Muslim world is also diversified by its two major sects, Sunnis and Shiites, as well as the various cultures in which Islam lives. Another point we made in 1992. We detect no monolithic bloc or international effort behind Islamic groups and movements, but we have seen individual states provide support and safe haven to extremist and terrorist groups throughout the region. And now we see that with the Taliban in Afghanistan. We made the point that increasing coordination between such regimes and extremist groups and their resort to terrorism demands our vigilance. In the last analysis, however, it is social injustice, the lack of economic, social, educational opportunity, and the lack of political participation that provides the extremists a constituency. Then we sent out a message. Those governments which seek to broaden political participation in the region will find the United States supportive. At the same time, we suspect those who would use the democratic process to come to power only to destroy the very process in order to retain power and political dominance. And that's, as John mentioned, the quote that got a lot of headlines, we do not support one person, one vote, one time. And there, U.S. policy was in a quandary. because we knew that in Algeria, the FIS, the Islamic Extremist Party, was most likely to come to power if there were truly free and democratic elections held in Algeria. And we were, frankly, very concerned that if the FIS did come to power, it could destabilize the Maghreb, countries that we had very close relations to, such as Morocco, Tunisia, and even impact on Egypt. Now, we know the bloody history after those failed elections and when the military took over, and thousands upon thousands of Algerians lost their lives. So it's not a happy conclusion. But we took a stand. And again, one must not be arrogant to think that because the United States took a stand, things automatically happened in Algeria. It's fundamentally an Algerian phenomenon. We then said that we differ with those who, whatever their religion, practice terrorism, resort to violence, reject the peaceful resolution of conflicts, oppress minorities, preach intolerance, disdain political pluralism, or who violate internationally accepted standards regarding human rights. It is for just those reasons we have such basic differences with the secular governments, for example, in Iraq and Libya. Simply stated, religion does not determine positively or negatively the nature of our relations with other countries. Our quarrel is with extremism per se, and the violence, denial, intolerance, intimidation, coercion, and terrorism which accompany it. Again, this is 1992. So while I believe this approach still constitutes a valid basis for U.S. policy on this increasingly important issue, especially in light of September 11th, the time has come for us to move ahead in a more comprehensive way to face the challenges of the 21st century. And we need to go beyond our present approach, I believe, to frame a policy which acknowledges the broad scope of the challenge and departs from the following principles of action. Let me go through these quickly. First, a mechanistic approach. In terms of the organization of our own government and our own society as we approach this issue, the United States government must better understand the depth and complexity of the forces at play in this region, I'm speaking now of the Muslim world, in order to form the basis for realistic and effective policy planning and formulation. And one of the simplest things we can do is enhance our foreign language capabilities in our national security agencies, from the Foreign Service to the CIA, to all the other branches of the government that interact both outside the United States and within our government in Washington and policy formulation. Special emphasis has to be placed on languages such as Arabic, Turkic languages, and Farsi. Second, while accepting Islam as one of the world's great religions with its mainstream message of tolerance and recognition of the people of the book, that is, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, U.S. policy must strongly differentiate in word and deed between this mainstream of Islam on the one hand, and on the other hand, Muslim individuals, groups, and regimes which work against U.S. interests by their advocacy of terrorism, violence, repression, and a quest for authoritarian rule. The United States should also strengthen its support of and work more closely with moderate Islamic governments, which are at least making a serious effort to be responsive to the needs of their people for social justice, more participatory government, and economic growth through free market economies. We need to engage more directly with such countries in elaborating our approach to this part of the world. Easier said than done. And that is one of the fault lines of our policy to date. We need to proceed realistically and without any grand illusions. In individual countries, we will find religious figures expressing a diversity of views from moderate to radical, and each country has to deal effectively with internal problems involving Islamist political movements and groups. Third recommendation is that The United States should, as a consistent policy, urge and work actively with governments in the Muslim world to reach out to their own societies on the dual track of broadening participatory government and free market forces as expeditiously as their particular circumstances permit. Small things have happened, but they're significant. Jordan's parliamentary opening to the Muslim Brotherhood at the time was a bold and important development. At the same time, the United States should promote privatization and market economies as the most effective approach in the final analysis to diminish the manifestations of social injustice, which help give rise to extremism. In so doing, however, we must be sensitive to the complexities involved. The modernization process of the West is viewed in parts of the world with suspicion and even hostility, and is alien to their culture and beliefs. Imposition of secular ideas can lead to resistance. This is certainly the case of those individuals, groups, and classes in these countries who are not sharing in the modernization process and who see themselves as largely dispossessed victims. This is indeed the breeding ground, in my view, of extremism. That is why it is essential in launching and fostering modernization programs to assure that the fruits of political participation, market reforms, and economic and social development are shared by the greatest number of people. A key element here, therefore, is effective political dialogue between governments and a broad spectrum of their societies, coupled with viable economic policies that benefit large sectors of the populations involved and the creation of strong middle classes. The United States should tailor its approach to each country with the understanding that we should not try to establish Western political models in many of these societies, which are traditionalist in nature and have their own forms of political consultation, the shura, which can be expanded along the lines of our democratic principles. And this is where I believe we should place our emphasis. On the economic side, with the fall of communism and the acknowledged failings of Marxist and socialist models within and outside the Muslim world, the merits of private enterprise and free market economies are increasingly evident. The United States, in concert with the Europeans, the Japanese, for example, must, I believe, assert a more important role in encouraging the governments of this region to initiate and sustain market reforms, fight corruption, especially in those countries which are hamstrung by archaic and inefficient status systems. Fourth, the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict will certainly help to diffuse anti-Western sentiment among Muslims and undercut the influence and spoiler potential of the Islamist extremist groups, especially in the Levant. This conflict has been an important factor in forming Muslim attitudes toward the West. Indeed, we have seen how the secular dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, cynically wrapped himself in the cloak of Islam during the Gulf War to attack Israel and its Western supporters, and how the militantly Islamist regime of mullahs in Iran have translated their strident public stance against Israel in the West into active support of groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the PFLP-GC, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So in this context, it becomes even more important that the efforts of the United States to advance the Arab-Israeli peace process proceed in a meaningful way. Fifth and lastly, the United States government, in the elaboration of its policies after the Cold War and on the eve of the next century, must also take cognizance of the underestimated role of religion in international affairs. We must be prepared to complement our political, economic, and security policies with efforts aimed at fostering, wherever appropriate, an understanding of these religious and cultural policies, factors in the elaboration of our own policy, and wherever possible, to encourage enhanced exchanges amongst Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So, in sum, instead of building walls, we need to build bridges. Indeed, I believe the challenge before us in this 21st century is to determine how we can maintain and develop our own set of values and at the same time coexist and interact with other value systems and cultures which will continue on their own path. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz contends that you can't assert yourself in the world as if nobody else was there, because this is not a clash of ideas. There are people attached to these ideas. If you want to live without violence, you have to realize that other people are as real as you are. Thank you.
Now we want to take some time for questions, and there are people with microphones nearby. I would like to, we're somewhat limited in the time we have available, so I want to ask you two things. One, ask one question, and two, ask a question, rather than make a speech, and if you would indicate to whom you would like your question addressed. Yes.
Thank you very much. You have all addressed these issues beautifully. Would some of you or all of you comment on the role of state terrorism in bringing us to the current impasse we have?
Well, the question of terrorism is always interesting, depending on where you sit, or perhaps where you suffer. And I have found it interesting in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that America, sometimes in the Jewish community as well, we focus on suicide bombers, but very rarely on helicopter gunships. And I have said that suicide bombers are the helicopter gunships of the Palestinian people, which is not to condone anybody killing anybody, which I would, like all of us, prefer not to happen. But in a war, you have to ask yourself, when you push a people to the wall with sophisticated arms, what do you expect them to do? So I think we also, as Americans, need to reflect on our ability to terrorize others through our armaments, used by others and used by ourselves. So the question of terrorism is a very, very important question, but we often argue the question as if it is only the weak, as if it is only the bomb and the plane, but has nothing to do with nation states.
I would just very briefly say that we've got issues of state terrorism in the region, and we've had them, I mean, for years. But in terms of the current situation, unless somebody proves otherwise, and we're not talking here about an Iraqi connection, we're not talking here about an Iranian connection. And then just to dovetail with something that you just said, it was when people want to talk about suicide bombers, I think what people forget is that most suicide bombers, not all, most suicide bombers are dying for something. It's a little different than the way in which we normally think of suicide. They are dying for something. And some of you may have seen some of the interviews on television in which someone said, you don't understand. What some of these young people are doing is, feeling powerless, they turn themselves into a weapon to strike back. It's an interesting thing to think about. They're going up against a conventional weapon. They don't have a weapon. So then they turn themselves into a weapon, but they're dying or believe that they are dying for something. And I think that's what one needs to keep in mind.
In light of the fact that the Gulf War costs the world economy at least...
Put the mic in your mouth.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Good.
In light of the fact that the Gulf War cost the world economy in excess of $400 billion, and the current situation seems to be at least as expensive potentially, might the U.S. engage in an energy policy of domestic resources, Alberta oil sands, Venezuelan heavy crude? It's hard to believe it would cost more than $800 billion to develop those resources. And
I recommend you read the joint study that the Council on Foreign Relations and the Baker Institute published about 3 months ago on recommendations for energy security policy, in which conservation and various alternatives in terms of alternative and emerging technologies comes into play. There's much that can be done in this area, but it's such a complex issue. But I do recommend that report. It's on our website, www.bakerinstitute.org.
Question over here.
My question is from one Hoya to another, to Dr. Esposito. In a recent New York Times article, you were quoted, and rather either correctly or incorrectly, about how bin Laden has kind of picked up the ball where the Iranian Islamic Revolution has, their power has waned over the last 20 years, and bin Laden has picked up and come into the void. Not to overlook the importance of what's going on here and now with terrorism, what's going to happen, or where are we looking, or where could we look for the next bin Laden, or for the next power that will come after perhaps bin Laden is gone?
Well, I mean, I think that there are just, I don't want to exaggerate it, but there are a fair number of folk out there. If I were worried about terrorism in the United States, I'd look outside and I'd look inside. You know, we've got lots of it here. It's remarkable when you think about it that after Oklahoma, we haven't had significant arrests. We haven't had, it seems, significant overt success. So I think that we're going to continue to have problems from overseas in terms of global terrorism, but we ought to look here. And I think one of the things we have to realize, the nature of global terrorism, is that when you look at what just happened on September 11th, it doesn't take a lot of people, and it doesn't take a lot of sort of heavy-duty resources to engage in what they engage in. And therefore, from my point of view, for the foreseeable future, it's going to be here. The question is whether or not we can contain and limit, but not whether or not one can, with radical surgery, eliminate, and certainly not eliminate it within the foreseeable future.
I found that I learned more about Jewish fundamentalism from Professor Esposito's speech than I did from Rabbi Ellis, Professor Ellis. And I think that Professor Ellis was talking about a very important issue with regard to how Israel and Palestine issues are being dealt with, but it wasn't the issue at hand, which is Jewish fundamentalism. And I wonder if you would speak to the issue of how powerful an influence Jewish fundamentalism has, and how it has paralleled since the 60s exactly the analysis which we heard about Muslim fundamentalism in the Israeli phenomenon. I mean, you cannot set up a government today without Jewish fundamentalists, and it's having a powerful impact on the whole Middle East situation, certainly on the internal situation in Israel. Would you speak to that?
Yes, I once gave a sermon in a Unitarian church, and they gave me 20 minutes, and somebody complained I didn't cover everything. And I told them, I had told the minister if he'd given me 40 minutes, I would have covered everything. So I chose to speak on why Jewish fundamentalism was not the problem. I chose that for a reason, because it is not the basic problem. But it has added to the problem, and it has been used by the state to accomplish its goals. And therefore, in doing that, it has made Jewish fundamentalism more powerful. So I wanted to place it in its context. The narrative in the United States that has supported Israel and the narrative that has come out of Israel for support globally has been a liberal, secular, moderately religious narrative, not a fundamentalist narrative. The state has used fundamentalism, like it uses Christian fundamentalism, to promote its own policies that have been shared by conservative and liberal prime ministers, from Rabin, Netanyahu, Shamir, Barak. The policies have been the same. If we want to decrease the power of Jewish fundamentalists, we need to face, as moderates and liberals, the crisis of the settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. If you have a situation where politics is militarized, religion will be militarized. If you demilitarize politics and the political situation, religion will be demilitarized. There was an interesting program on C-SPAN recently by a number of people speaking, one of them a Palestinian, who claimed quite correctly that most of the nationalist movements among Palestinians have been secular, not religious. But as the situation has deteriorated, religion has become more and more important. So my suggestion, I didn't get to it because I didn't have enough time, but in my paper that I submitted, I do speak about it, is to see Jerusalem as the broken middle of Israel-Palestine, shared completely by Jews and Palestinians, begin a new journey together of equality, invest Jews and Palestinians in a joint future, then Jewish fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism will decrease. But I spoke about the liberal, moderate narrative to make it clear. Elie Wiesel has been way, 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 way more important in disguising what's been happening on the West Bank than Jewish fundamentalists have been in promoting those settlements. So that's why I emphasize that.
I'd like to give you an anecdote that I think is a bit different from what the rabbi is saying in terms of how...
I'm not a rabbi.
I'm sorry, but you're sorry.
In terms of ordination.
Coordination.
I don't want to get into the other.
I hope there won't
It's okay, it's okay.
I hope there won't be a bolt of lightning up there. We paid a lot of money for this building. When I was ambassador to Israel, and we were working on the possibility, which was quite near at hand at the time, of serious negotiations between Israel and Syria over the Golan Heights. A man who I respect a great deal, Yitzhak Rabin, was prime minister, and I was absolutely fascinated to see how he was working one aspect of Jewish religion in Israel in terms of his approach to the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who is the chief rabbi of the ultra-Orthodox sect in Israel and has one of the greatest followings in Israel. And Rabin, one of the most intelligent men I've ever dealt with in my life, realized full well that the rabbi could be of such great to his negotiations because he preached the sanctity of life over the sanctity of land. This is phenomenal. Just think of that, how that can translate into political terms and bring one of the most important constituencies in Israel to support, eventually, a territorial compromise over the Golan Heights. Now, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was the chief ultra-Orthodox rabbi. So it's such a complex issue when you talk about Jewish fundamentalism and ultra-Orthodox, but here's a wonderful example of where politics and religion mix, and we hoped at that time that it would help us get to a certain point. Unfortunately, it didn't, but a lot of that groundwork still remains in place.
Okay, got one there.
Thank you for the wonderful talk from everybody. I have a question about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. We always say, I know we always hear that America and the CIA was not ready in 1979 for the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And how do you explain Iran-Contra affair during Iran-Iraq war? And at the same time, Saddam was an ally. And how do we explain bin Laden in his role in Russia-Afghanistan war? And when bin Laden was supported by the US government. I can go on, but this is it. I mean, can you explain that? I mean, that's the question I always have, and I can come up with an answer.
I think the only abbreviated way I can answer your question is say that the principle of unintended consequences has many manifest meanings and results. Certainly, when we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the policy calculation, and I was at that time head of the political section in Moscow when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the political calculation was that by creating indigenous opposition to the Soviet occupying forces in Afghanistan, we would be able to help promote a fatal flaw against the Soviet invading armies in Afghanistan, but also have a very major impact on the viability of the Soviet Union if it suffered a ignoble defeat in Afghanistan. We succeeded all too well. We supported the Mujahideen, we provided them with weaponry, we provided them with training, but the principle of unintended consequences, and here I think in retrospect one of the failures of our policy is that once we had won that war, we turned away from Afghanistan. And we neglected that part, as South Asia, we neglected quite a bit. And history has shown what happened to Afghanistan, internal strife and the rise of the Taliban, this extremist Islamist group, to state power, and what we're facing now. So it's the principle of unintended consequences. The calculation was based on what I said, and we didn't see far enough down the line, and we didn't put into the equation what are now called the Arab Afghans, the bin Ladens of the world.
We have some constraints on time, and Dr. Esposito has to be gone soon. So I think we'll bring this to a close this evening, but I want to thank Dr. Weber, Esposito, Dr. Ellis, Ambassador Jerigian, for these extremely thoughtful and stimulating remarks. I think they've given us all a great deal to think about, and I hope enhanced your appreciation and understanding of things, as I believe it has for me. Thank you very much for coming. We welcome you to the